This is when we're talking about race evasiveness, this is the neglect or silencing of race and racism. And it's largely reinforcing the idea that race is insignificant and it does not matter and does not impact your daily life. And so in our survey, 42% of all TOSITs reported experiencing acts of discrimination, 60% of Black teachers, 41% of Indigenous teachers, 37% of AAPI teachers report feeling uncomfortable expressing themselves as a person of color or as an Indigenous person on their school site. Large recommendation for this is prioritize and value constructive race-centered conversations in the classroom and around campus that includes students of color. If we don't actually talk about the issue, we can't actually face it and try to address it. The next finding was around curriculum and pedagogy. The curriculum and pedagogy for pre-service teachers, it really impacts how they internalize the profession. And after decades of really centering the work of white men in our theology, in our conceptualization of how students learn of education, a lot of teacher preparation programs have been structured to systematically foster culturally white environments. And so there's a lack of diversity, there's a lack of cultural representation in the curriculum and the pedagogy, not just at the K-12 sites, but also in our institutions of higher education. Another thing that is also happening, which we all feel and we all know, is that the rise of political pressure on teachers and the teaching profession of what they teach. Teachers have talked about feeling horrible not to be allowed to teach in the style that fits their personalities and feeling forced to follow a script. And it's also being linked as the second reason why teachers are considering to leave the profession is because of political and ideological attacks, which is the data point that has not been seen and has only recently been on the radar in the past 4 years. It comes second after burnout, which is unheard of. So, and then the very last thing is testing. And 66% of teachers do not pass only 66% of teachers pass the CBEST on their first attempt. And about a quarter of, if you're an elementary school teacher, only about a quarter of the teachers that do not pass the test actually don't come back to take it in the next 3 years. So they essentially walk away from the test, but also walk away from the profession because they're not passing it. There's a lot of reasons for this, but there's no preparation that's embedded into our teacher preparation programs that really just focus on theory and concept and not necessarily on passing these standardized tests. So as wrap up, healthy racial climates in the teaching profession has to be a non-negotiable. We all have to be critically conscious and culturally competent. And then also coming to terms with addressing our contributing roles in a society and in a program that is structurally biased and racist. We have to be able to call the thing and be able to address it appropriately. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Gary Orfield, who may not need an introduction, but I'll just say is our state has benefited from his failure at retirement. Gary is the Distinguished Research Professor of Education, Law, and Political Science and Urban Planning at UCLA. And of course, he's the founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Project and the UCLA Civil Rights Project, and works and written many important books. Some of them are available for raffle today. Go for it, Gary.
When we were interviewing for the first worker for the Civil Rights Project, of course, we had no money, which has been a continuing condition many years. But Mikal was just a young master's student who looked like she was an early undergraduate. And when I interviewed her and I came to Chris Edley and said, we had to hire this young woman. He said, oh, she's so young, she's not a law student. I said, she doesn't know what she can't do. So she'll probably be able to do almost everything. And that turned out to be true. I won't give her any chance to rebut. So I'm going to talk about an area called Los Santos. It's the area between Los Angeles, San Diego, and Tijuana. And it's an area of tremendous importance. Our project, you probably noticed, has a subtitle, Proyecto de Derechos Civiles. We never thought boundaries or languages should end or control or limit consideration of issues of racial justice. And we recognize that our countries are continuously interacting, and that the country, the United States society, has been changed incredibly dramatically by immigration in the last 50 years. It's a different society now. In this area, Los Santos, it includes 5 counties of Southern California, where most people in California have lived for a long time. Southern California is the dominated California population. It includes Tijuana, which is now the 2nd largest city in Mexico. So it includes, back in the beginning of the 20th century, it was a largely vacant area. Los Angeles was a little over 100,000 people. San Francisco was about 20,000. Tijuana was less than 1,000. It was just a ranch. Now this area is one of the densest, most highly populated areas on Earth. And it's deeply interconnected in many, many respects. And there's been a huge transfer of people across these boundaries as Southern California has become, in terms of its young population, 60% Latino. So we have been through a huge change. This area is extremely creative and powerful economically. Just these 5 counties of Southern California equal the 10th largest economy in the world. It's a very, very rich area that has been very successful, and it's been successful by solving problems of tremendous magnitude. There were no good harbors in Southern California. The people in San Diego got the Navy to dredge one and to make it the headquarters. Los Angeles doesn't have any harbor, but it built them. And they are the 2 most active harbors in the United States now. There were no connections with the rest of the country. The 2 largest railroads in the country came to and competed because they were drawn. Water wasn't available. Water was solved. So this is an area of, had very few natural resources, but had tremendous inventiveness, creativity, and power, and grew enormously. Now this paper, it's a very long paper that would have been released had another administration come into power. But within the last 3 weeks, almost everything that's in it has been attacked by the new administration. So there will have to be another version. Basically, President Trump has said he will institute a 25% tariff. He will institute a 100% tariff on many businesses and up to 200% on the ones he really hates. And he will drive Mexico, if he does anything like this, into a serious recession, create economic chaos. This particular area, which is a very, very interactive area, there's almost no place on Earth where so many people cross the border every day as on the Tijuana main crossing. It's huge. So we are an interactive, interdependent population of more than 24 million people that has a very large creative economy, and it has tremendous inequality. Both of these countries, the US and Mexico, are among the most unequal economic societies in the world. And California is one of the most unequal parts of the United States. If you look at the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, California ranks 5th from the bottom of the 50 states. The ones that are competing with it are pretty unimpressive. So what we're talking about in this paper, if it had been written and released properly, is looking at a unique opportunity that's coming at Mexico right now. In 2021, there was what's called the supply side, or the supply chain crisis. It broke down. Relationships with China broke down. And we have, as a result, a desperate search for alternative ways to supply the American market. Most products from China come in through California. California is the transit point, and basically in the Los Angeles area. So we're talking about a huge possibility of changing. Mexico became the leading trading partner of the United States 2 years ago. It was again last year. There's a huge economic boom that could come along if the manufacturing that's now connected in China is shifted in large ways to California. And a lot of that would shift along to the border and the near north side of Mexico. So what this paper was about was what could be done? What could be done? And what we talked about in the paper is think about the institutions that exist. Think about the ones that aren't going to do much, like the Mexican government, which has had no development policy really, and doesn't have an education strategy. But think about the fact that Mexico has the least gain in productivity of any major country over the last generation. Mexico is a place that has almost no high-achieving students in math and science. Mexico, we have on one side of the border one of the big tech hubs of the world, the other side, no tech. What could we do? The CHIPS Act, which Congress enacted, provides many billions of dollars for new investment in plants, many of which could logically be located in Mexico. Could we use that to produce economic gains and to spur educational reform, especially at the higher levels? I've got to stop in a second, but let me just say a couple of things. There is no doubt that the opportunity that's there, even after what Trump has said, is huge. And there's no doubt that it's unlikely to be realized unless various institutions take a role. One of them is the university systems on both sides, because the tech connection between the US and Mexico is all within almost walking distance of that border. There are Nobel Prize operations going on in a very short drive from places where there is no tech and where there is lots of money that could develop new tech. So basically, what this paper would have said is it's time to do this. This is a unique opportunity. Even with what Trump has done, there still is a very important opportunity. And just yesterday, they named Peter Navarro, who negotiated the extension of the North American free market in the last year of the Trump administration, to be a negotiator. So maybe he can once again convince Trump not to torpedo all of these possibilities. But the possibilities are real. And the people who would gain the most are Latinos in Southern California, who are very poorly educated, particularly in higher education, and who have huge to gain if their job structure were to change. And the people in Tijuana, who have mostly informal jobs and very little mobility, but have lives that are transformed if they do achieve higher education. Thank you very much.
Okay, last but not least is Dr. Alexis Patterson-Williams, who's professor in the School of Education at UC Davis, where I get to get the fortunate to call her my colleague. She's also chair of the teacher education program at UC Davis. And Dr. Patterson Williams's research lies at the intersection of equity, social psychology, and science education.
All right, so I'll just get started while we wait for the slides to come up. So good morning. I'll be sharing from our report, Racial Reckoning and the Roles of Schooling, which reviews educational research on desegregating classrooms and developing racial literacy in schools. So diverse schools have been elusive despite court decisions transitioning schools from separate but equal to recognizing segregation as inherently unequal. Progress remains limited. The release of districts from desegregation orders has led to resegregation of neighborhood schools, with white and Latinx students experiencing the highest level of segregation in the US, and the segregation of Black students becoming more pronounced. As Orfield and Eaton note, desegregation is not a cure for societal inequality. Racial and socioeconomic integration should be seen as essential to equalizing access and opportunity. However, even integrated schools often perpetuate inequality with academic tracking in diverse schools, exacerbating racial disparities, with white and Asian students being placed in advanced courses and Black and Latinx students being segregated into special education or remedial tracks. So Francis and Darity show that this within school segregation results from resistance to desegregation. Thus, the root cause remains unsolved systemic racism. In the summer of 2020, the idea of racial reckoning gained prominence in the media, though its actualization is uncertain, especially when over half of the states in the US currently have passed laws or in the process of passing laws that ban or restrict race-based instruction in public schools or universities. Today, we offer a three-pronged approach for supporting racial reckoning in our schools and classrooms. So evidence strongly supports the benefits of integrating schools, with Johnson documenting improved educational outcomes, economic stability, and reduced incarceration rates. While racism remains the primary obstacle to educational equity, diverse schools reduce racial bias and foster interracial relationships that promote progressive policies. Achieving equitable integration then demands attention to pedagogical approaches that foster academic competence across racial and academic backgrounds. Research on small group dynamics reveal how race-based status inequalities can be addressed through integrating pedagogy. Elizabeth Cohen demonstrated that altering expectations of competence can promote more equitable group interactions for Black students, while Cohen and Lotan showed that status treatments can reduce participation inequities in classroom settings. Additionally, Rachel Lotan emphasizes the importance of group-worthy tasks, and these are tasks that are open-ended, content-rich, and leverage diverse student strengths. These pedagogical choices are crucial as classroom practices actively shape racialized identities and understandings. In addition to how teachers teach in diverse classrooms, what they teach deserves equal consideration. When students leave their classrooms, they will enter communities that are shaped by profound inequities, necessitating curricula that address racism and systemic injustice. Anti-racist critical pedagogies empower students to advocate for social justice. Now, while integrating pedagogy elevates the urgency of building equal status connections between students, the goal of integrating curricula plays the long game by framing the education of marginalized groups in its capacity to empower and disentangle their oppression. So liberatory pedagogy views education as integral to the democratic process. And although the evidence on the impact of liberatory pedagogy is still growing, quasi-experimental research designs demonstrate that pedagogical interventions focused on race and social change can increase collectivism and social action among racially minoritized students. Moreover, white students exposed to curricula addressing racism are most likely to reduce bias and develop empathy for peers of color. Studies also show that white students engaged in critical pedagogy are more likely to recognize the contributions of people of color. Thus, in addition to improving academic metrics like GPA and attendance, critical pedagogies can advance racial equality. So to foster students' empowerment and community liberation, we argue classrooms adopt diverse teaching methods that prepare all students to be anti-racist advocates for change. In closing, the persistent segregation of schools by race and class remains troubling for those of us who view interracial contact as essential for justice. However, signs of progress are emerging. Wells reports increasing public support for integrated schools, with younger generations of white parents more open to sending their children to racially diverse schools. And with parents of color continuing to seek out opportunities for quality education, including choosing magnet programs with socioeconomic diversity requirements. To further this progress, ranking schools by both achievement and racial economic integration could encourage parents to prioritize diversity when choosing schools. Additionally, there are broader opportunities for desegregation through through school assignment policies using school districts' administrative authority. Anderson and Frankenberg identify four strategies for voluntary integration. That is to diversify student admissions to magnet schools, to change attendance zone boundaries, to leverage district-wide choice with civil rights protections, and then considering diversity in school and student transfers. Despite legal and political challenges, districts in New York City, New Jersey, and San Antonio are pursuing integration efforts. Within our local context, the passage of California's Assembly Bill 101 and its centering of ethnic studies in high schools puts us closer to liberatory education in schools and underscores the need for integrative pedagogy and a diverse, well-prepared teaching force. Thus, we call on political leaders to prioritize integrating schools as they are essential to our multicultural democracy. We call on teacher educators to deepen their engagement in research and training of teachers on racial reconciliation, and we call on school leaders to address ongoing racial inequalities within their school sites and hiring processes. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, we're gonna open it up to Q&A, and I think we have a mic going around, right? Yes, great.
Hi, I'm Junia Kim. I'm the Cradle to Career Director of Programs and Evaluation from Hayward Promise Neighborhoods in the Bay Area. Prior to that, I was a teacher for about a decade. And I think I'm still kind of processing what we discussed from session one when it comes to just desegregating our schools, and even just sometimes wondering when it comes to school choice, sometimes like families gravitate towards schools that have higher, like, it might look like segregation, but it's also they're choosing to be in spaces where there's just higher populations of students of color that they identify with. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the teacher pipeline, what is the percentage of like teachers of color who stay or who are able to stay? And how does that kind of impact the desegregation efforts?
Stay in the same school or stay in teaching?
Teaching, just stay in teaching.
So the question is, like, how many teachers, like, what's the percentage of teachers that stay in teaching after, what's the? Mm. Yeah, and that's an issue that we're having with the entire state of California on their inability to give us up-to-date data on the demographics of the teacher population. That data hasn't been publicly available since 2018, 2019. And so it does impact the type of research that we can do because we can't actually assess what are the demographics of current teachers across the state. I can tell you that teachers of color are nationally have higher attrition, I think by, I don't want to give a wrong data number, but have higher attrition than their white counterparts. Sure.
I don't know if Yeah, I don't have the exact number there, but I do know that that both attrition and overall rates for teachers of color are much lower nationally. And they exit the profession, more likely to exit the profession. Next. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for all your work. Louis Friedberg at EdSource. This is a question for Kai, but I guess anyone can answer this. I mean, in California, the last few years, there's been a big push to make teacher credentialing and that whole pipeline more affordable. I guess they've restored some of these grants that would cover the cost of the credentialing programs. Do we know what impact that is having yet?
Yeah.
Because obviously there has been a big push in California to address that.
Yeah, and those pushes have definitely supported the teachers who are already in the not already in the pipeline, but folks who are already deciding to become teachers and be on the education track. I think what we're dealing with now, particularly post-pandemic, is an issue of, and we've always had a retainment issue, but now even more so, we're having a recruitment issue because of the image of what it is to be a teacher and to become a teacher, particularly for teachers of color. There is the narrative is this a viable profession? What is being said is that you're underpaid, you're undersupported, and you're undervalued. And a lot of teachers of color, people of color, are, when they're going into their post-secondary education, getting their degrees, putting up money, time, and effort to advance their life outcomes, families and them do not see the education pathway or career or profession as something that was going to give a return on their investment. But it definitely has. I think we should be doubling down. We know just already from the opening that residencies are pushing the needle on the diversity in which we can recruit, and also preparing close to debt-free pathways for folks. But that should be the gold standard across the state, is that we, number one, have a debt-free pathway, that residencies are the model of choice, but close to 70% of all teachers are still on a traditional teaching pathway, which means that they are paying and taking time off from full-time work for at least 6 months to 12 months to get their teaching credential. And there's only a certain demographic of people who can do that successfully and still live in the most expensive state in the country, so.
Well, and I'll just add to that, that in addition to the residencies, which are increasing the numbers of teachers of color, that funding is starting to dissipate. So programs that are interested in creating more diverse pathways to attract a more diverse teacher workforce, those opportunities to apply for the kind of funding that would allow for those partnerships between traditional programs and local agencies are starting to diminish. So it looks like that window of opportunity, although successful, is starting to close again. And I think in addition to what feels like uncertain times around major sources of funding, even for traditional programming like the Golden State Fund, which has decreased in the last year. And we're just uncertain about whether or not it will even continue. And so there are folks I know who were interested in pursuing residency programs who did not continue because they were unsure of how much they would get from those types of funding. So I think that we've definitely are coming out of a moment that seems a little uncertain given the funding situation currently.
Also, just in addition to it's not just also the funding, there is an entire infrastructure that needs to be set up in
Mhm.
order to successfully run a residency program that ties the institution of higher education with the school site, that there are models of that, but it's not widespread of how to, there's lack of support. So like a school district that is bigger in an urban area might have the resources, the fund, the human capital to manage such a program and to implement such a program. But you're talking about for across the state in these smaller districts, building a pipeline from the ground up and a structure and a relationship and a program that has never existed between the university and these school districts. It's not, without any type of model, without any type of support and guidelines of how do you run a residency that should be provided by the state, it's really hard to ask that of the schools and also the programs. Just a couple questions.
Thank you. I'm Natasha Collins with the Assembly Appropriations Committee, and I'm really interested in this, the discussion around desegregation. And we've heard a lot of ideas this morning, I think, about housing, about more accountability, for example, with magnets and charters, with incentives. And I guess I'm just wondering from your perspectives, what would be like if the legislature, the governor would come forward with one proposal, what do you think would be the most impactful? And I realize that's a really hard question and it's very entangled. But I think it would be helpful to know what that number one policy change might be.
Great question. Yeah.
The House of Representatives passed a bill to give funding to help plan for diversity in 2020, right after the nationwide riots over Black Lives Matter. But it went nowhere in the Senate. That would be something that'd be worth looking at. We need incentives. When we had incentives to help people plan desegregation, which were eliminated back by the Ronald Reagan and have never been restored, people were really interested in them. We've had really small ones, and there have been many applicants for them. So if we have small incentives, if we had some requirements attached to magnet schools, which were intended to be diverse and have really lost their way in many places becoming exam schools, or if we had some diversity requirements for renewing charters, we could begin to get people thinking about how to do this. The state of California Attorney General has sued at least one district for intentional discrimination. There's lots of plans. There's lots of district lines being drawn in California to protect privileged people out in suburban racial change. There's a lot of things that are going on that need to be looked at seriously. So another part of this is to look at the discrimination that is really taking place as we go through racial change. We're right in the middle of huge, huge racial change in all of our suburban rings.
I don't know exactly what the exact policy is, but it has to be something around housing, particularly since our schools are being funded through the local LCAPs and that is being funded through, our schools are also being supported by the housing taxes and property rates. I think that as long as our neighborhoods are desegregated or segregated, then our local schools will also reflect all of the things that come with that. And so we're seeing it in the inequality across the supports that are given, the materials that are used, the quality and education of the teachers that are staffing these schools. Even for teachers of color, it's hard for them to live in the school districts that they work. This is a particular issue for the Bay, and also for Los Angeles County. So I think it has to be something, you know, one of the initiatives that we're trying to push, especially with the GI Bill for teachers, is equitable housing or some type of housing stipend or subsidy for educators so that they can at least afford a house in the communities in which they serve. And I can see that that could trickle down to students and their families as well. So it's something around housing, but I don't know exactly what that looks like.
California is building some very expensive family housing, and it's building it in areas with really weak segregated schools. That should simply stop.
Well, and we've seen we were conducting some research across school districts and asking them what they did with the money that they received from the pandemic. In Jefferson Unified School District, I think it was Jefferson in the Bay Area. One of the things that I thought that they did that was unique and creative was actually providing housing subsidies for their teachers, right? And so I do think housing is a really important piece of this. And we know that it is possible to provide teachers the support to live so that we can attract a diverse workforce and so that we can create diversity within the communities that our students are living.
I agree with all that has been said. I think that for sure housing is very expensive and it's a huge impediment. But you know, maybe from econ, one of the things that you learn is that, you know, the carrot on the stick helps a lot to attract people. So give out some carrots, whether it is housing or, I mean, universities have done that before also with housing for faculty. So it's not that crazy or difficult to do. I think it's something that could be done. But I think overall, I think that, I mean, one of the things that it's clear is that there is also burnout and lack of recognition.
40 years.
And, you know, so really something that incentivizes really people to invest and make that investment. Yeah. Please.
Hi there, Kristen Polcarpio with MALDEF, a former educator, and was really interested to know throughout your research, have you heard from teachers of color, those who maybe moved on from the profession or who are remaining in the profession, who've indicated that like they've experienced either or implicit racism or discrimination within the role, and that being one of the reasons why they wouldn't want to remain in the profession, like either through administration or through other colleagues or through just through anything, right? Like, I think that's something that I've been hearing on the ground anecdotally and would be really interested to hear if you all have seen that in your research, if there's like any data points that you've received on that issue.
Yeah, in the survey that we did, I think it was over 40% of teachers of color said that they've experienced racial discrimination on their campus by administrators, coworkers, parents, students. And the larger issue is that when they report it, it gets pretty much like swept under the rug or just kind of diminished. And one of the bigger findings is that there is actually no like official accountability systems to document certain instances and experiences that these teachers have had. I was talking with someone the other day about the issues of school districts continuing to keep teachers who have been accused of abuse, right? From a student, whether that be physical, sexual, but like we don't get rid of them because of, I don't actually know why, I can't really justify it, but the excuse is that we don't have enough teachers or we don't have enough proof. And while this investigation is going on, the teacher will remain on campus. But the issue there is that the real issue there is that there is no actual system in place. When a student does any type of misbehavior, there's a protocol and process. This is who we call. This is step 1, step 2, step 3. They're removed from campus at this point. For teachers, it's almost like unfathomable or unthinkable. So we don't actually have a structure in place to say when a teacher misbehaves or when an administrator misbehaves or when this is happening to the adults on campus, what is the appropriate protocol? And so that lack of structure then just allows things to fall into this abyss and it never be fully addressed. And that's even when it's presented to the administrator, presented to their union rep, presented to the superintendent. Because of the lack of documentation, it just kind of falls by the wayside. So, and I do know that is brought into the issues of why teachers of color leave the profession at a faster rate, not just at a faster rate, but at a higher rate as well.
There's an interesting finding that we had access when we were at Harvard for a while to the NEA's national data set of all their teacher members. And we sampled them and we surveyed them. And we found out that the students or the teachers of color really had a strong preference for being in diverse schools. They preferred to be in schools that had the social, economic, and racial diversity. And they said it was likely to make them more likely to stay in the profession. It's a lot of times teachers of color get sent to entirely impoverished schools under tremendous stress and then punished for being failures and leave the profession. So thinking about that, it's especially for young teachers who are just starting out, sending them someplace where there's a little bit more hope for getting some quick results is something that's quite important. We shouldn't just assume that these teachers should go to the very hardest schools.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's a tension there within sending teachers of color to well-resourced schools, and then the safety, right? So in the research that I've done and speaking with various teachers of color, there's a fear, particularly even within California, within the districts that are upholding these policies against race-based instruction. There's a fear, there's a lot of bending over backwards about how do I teach in the ways that are in alignment with who I am, in alignment with the pedagogical approaches that that they believe in, right? So there's a fear, even to talk to me about their approaches to teaching. There was a fear of I'm going to be completely anonymized, I'm going to be protected. And these are folks that are in suburban districts, some of them, right? And so thinking about how they weather this political storm that we're in, even in the most well-resourced districts, they're coming up against that exhaustion of being the only one. So students flocking to them for support and not having the district or administrative level support because of the policies in place against anti-racist teaching.
I was gonna say there's a level of like identity labor that's like associated with being in these spaces. And oftentimes it's starting actually before they even get to the school site while they're at their universities getting their credentialing program. So as we know, a lot of, and this is an issue that we're coming against even in the program that I run at Urban Ed Academy, where we recruit Black men into teaching, and they're at schools that where usually they're the only ones. This is why it's necessary. So their mentor teachers are white, their professors are white. And it has, even with all of the resources and support that the program provides, there's a cultural difference that's not being met or addressed, and being kind of just ignored. Like, we want the diversity, but we're not going to change any part of our environment, our structure to make you feel more comfortable here. And how this white woman teaches is also how we're expecting you to teach, which is just fundamentally not what diversity is about. And so, and it's not to say that we shouldn't have cross-race mentors, but the reality is that when we're asking for people who have been historically marginalized from this profession to enter into this profession, that means we're also agreeing that the space itself is going to fundamentally shift to accommodate the diversity that we want to see. And so that's kind of what's not happening.
All right, we're going to give you the last question. Oh,
I'm curious to know what the panel would say to abolitionists who believe that segregation is not necessarily a bad thing. Can we freedom dream something completely different outside the existing systems that will likely either never change, or if they do, they will fall again with the next wave? The racial battle fatigue that happens for teachers of color when they go into integrated, primarily white spaces is what is exhausting. So can you imagine an alternative?
Definitely, definitely. I'm not opposed to segregation in and of itself. I'm opposed to the negative effects and impacts it has on the support that is given to these then very disparate spaces, right? So if the support and the funding and the structures are equitable, then I'm all for, like, you know, these safe spaces, race-based communities that exist to support and educate each other. I think the issue that we run up against is that when we are existing in the broader scheme of our society and our world, then what happens? Like, are we still being able to meet each other and greet each other with a level of respect and community and brotherhood and sisterhood? Or is it only reserved for these, you know? And so, and I think it's easier to, well, I can't say, I was gonna say that I think it's easier maybe for adults to manage that, but not really. But like making sure that our students are, one of our biggest complaints is that we want students to be exposed to different ideas, different people, and be able to navigate when you disagree with someone with respect and humanity. And can that happen in you know, same-base education and school systems? I think it can, but that will take a very concerted effort to do, and being mindful of that we're not existing in a vacuum here. And this is, I mean, I went to a historically Black college. I went to Spelman, so very niche, right? Very niche, and I loved it, and it changed my life forever. It is literally the reason I'm the person I am today is because I went to that school. And so I will forever advocate for having these type of spaces, but also but I also grew up in the K-12 system without ever having a Black teacher before I went to college, and had to navigate that. So I think we can definitely dream of a world, and it's like going to take people who want to push the boundaries of what we currently are existing in to do that.
that is a great note to end on. Thank you. Let's thank this panel, this amazing panel. Okay, so we're going to move into a break, which includes our lunch, which is already set up. We are going to reconvene at 1:10 for our keynote. And I just want to remind you that there are books there that we're going to raffle. So please go ahead and put your name there. And that you won't want to miss the keynote. So please come back. We are very lucky to have Thomas Sines will be doing our keynote. Thank you.
I have a big treat for you guys. It's our speaker. Thomas Sines is president and general counsel of MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He leads the organization in pursuing litigation, policy advocacy, community education to promote civil rights for all Latinos in the U.S. in the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, voting rights, and freedom from open bias. Sines joined MALDEF as its president in August 2009. And he has been lead counsel in numerous cases, including challenges to California's Proposition 187, which everyone here will remember, and California Proposition 227, which set us back substantially, and you'll hear more about later. Sines has argued before the U.S. Supreme Court in the United States versus Texas, representing interveners defending Obama administration deferred action initiatives, DACA, DAPA. So he is a tremendous resource to all of us, to the Latino community in particular, but to all of us, and a dear, dear friend. So Tom, please take over.
Thank you, Patricia, for that generous introduction. And thank you to both Patricia and Gary for inviting me to speak today. My thanks extends not only to the honor, and a great honor it is, of addressing a crowd following the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Civil Rights Project, but I have to note that I don't have a paper. So unlike the others presenting today, they have no idea what I'm going to say. They have not been immersed in reviewing or editing the remarks that I'm going to give. So they have great faith in me to allow me to speak without a prior written paper. They are great friends, and I do want to say congratulations on the 25th anniversary of the Civil Rights Project. It has undoubtedly been a consequential contributor nationwide to greater equity in education, which then begs the question, why would they invite me to speak? So I thought about what I would say today, and I speak to you having just celebrated 15 years as President and General Counsel of MALDEF. I had my quinceañero in August, which means I've got some experience, also means more than halfway through my likely tenure as President and General Counsel of MALDEF. But nonetheless, as I thought about what I would talk about today, I want to talk to you a bit about what I have instructed our education lawyers to look at and focus on as we create our education equity litigation agenda for the immediate future. But before I get there, I do want to lay some of the groundwork. First, I hope that all of you are familiar with MALDEF's work to understand that I think we have been an organization that has made significant litigation contributions to education equity, including, of course, MALDEF's perhaps most famous case, Plyler versus Doe, the 1982 U.S. Supreme Court decision that guarantees constitutionally a right to all students, regardless of immigration status, to attend public school free of charge from kindergarten through 12th grade. And mentioning that gives me the fortunate digression to say to all of you, and please, please share it with everyone you work with, to say to all of you that in my view, in MALDEF's view, Plyler versus Doe is not in imminent danger, despite what you may have heard, what you may continue to hear. It is not in imminent danger. Two main reasons. First, Plyler versus Doe is not just the decision from 1982. It has, since 1996, been incorporated in federal statutory law. That means there are two protections against any attempt to restrict the enrollment or attendance of undocumented students in public schools anywhere in the country. And the second reason is that if you actually think about it, no one, Donald Trump on down, no one actually wants to implement an exclusion of school of undocumented students. The simple reason being that no one, including Donald Trump, really wants their supportive base to see thousands of kids on street corners in the middle of the day instead of in school, especially if many of those kids are Latino. Trust me, Donald Trump does not want thousands of Latino kids on street corners as a result of an actual attempt to implement a violation of Plyler versus Doe. So with that digression, let me return to some of MALDEF's other important education work. MALDEF is also, of course, an organization that was involved in two different challenges to Proposition 187 and the education-related provisions thereof. I know Patricia said we all would remember it, but looking at the age of some in the room, some of you weren't around or conscious enough at the time, since it has now been 30 years since Proposition 187 was passed. But that proposition, anti-immigrant across the board, but was really an anti-public education initiative as well, and included two provisions that would have prevented undocumented students from enrolling in school kindergarten through 12th grade, a direct contradiction of Plyler, but another that would have prevented undocumented students' enrollment in public higher education, community college through the University of California. And MALDEF was involved in two challenges. One challenge together with the ACLU of Southern California and Mark Rosenbaum, who's in the room, and many others challenging the entirety of Proposition 187, but then a state court challenge to the higher education provision in particular. MALDEF is also the organization that was responsible in Texas for the Edgewood cases, which are the cases that challenge the inequitable distribution of funding among Texas school districts. We are also an organization that was involved here in California in challenging the inequitable distribution of school facilities throughout the state. First, through a case called Godinez versus State of California that challenged the way that state school construction funds were inequitably distributed in the early 2000s. And then as one of the co-counsel, again, with Mark Rosenbaum and the ACLU, in the Williams case, and in particular in the portion of Williams that targeted the inequitable distribution of existing school facilities throughout the state of California. More about that in a moment. So I think MALDEF has some credibility when it comes to education equity. So what we intend to do, I hope, would be of interest and importance to many of you. Just to give you an example of some of the work we're doing today in the education arena, we are litigating a case in Pasadena that involves an issue of increasing concern in multiple locations throughout this state and across the country, specifically related to how schools are selected for closure. So we see more and more reduction in enrollment leading to school closures, and how those decisions are made is an emerging, if not at this point, fully emerged issue of civil rights in our view, as we see those selections being made on the exact opposite basis of what they should be being based on. We view school closure decisions as being driven primarily by targeting students with the greatest resilience, the greatest ability to react successfully to the closure of their school and their forced transfer to another school. In fact, the exact opposite is what happens. School boards listen to the most vocal parents, and those are often the parents of the most resilient kids with the greatest indicators of resilience. But the school boards listen, and then in fact, they end up targeting the students with the least likely resilience to a potential school closure. And those are the ones who end up being involuntarily transferred to a new school away from a neighborhood school. Talk a little more about some of what we're doing as well as I go through, but I do want to get to telling you about what our focus will be. But to do that, I want to begin by telling a little personal story that I hope will not be too boring for most of you, but I think it is indicative of some of the thinking behind this. But it starts with the fact that after 15 years of leading MALDEF, after 33 years of being a civil rights lawyer, I have talked to many, many, many students in college or recently graduated from college who want to talk about whether they should go to law school and how to get in if they should go to law school. And in my conversations with those dozens, if not hundreds of students, I've said to every one of them, you must have a very, very strong reason to go to law school, because law school is consciously designed to test you and put you through the most difficult circumstances to test your mental commitment. So you have to have one thing that is so important to you that it will get you through some of the most difficult times in your educational career. And I tell all of these students, it doesn't matter what that is. It could be making money. If it's that important to you and you are convinced that law school graduation is the key to making money, that's going to get you through difficult times, more power to you. But I tell all of them that what it was for me was a commitment to doing civil rights work, to being able to go into court and champion civil rights. Now, what I don't tell them is that there are many, many students I know who had the same chief motivator, primary commitment when they entered law school. But I think for all of us who are in that situation, you end up going into law school and feeling somewhere through con law in your first year that you're the victim of a bait and switch. And I'll explain why. Because as a student who was not exposed to many lawyers growing up, I think I may have met one prior to my being a 17-year-old senior in high school, and that was to shake the hand of the school board member who happened to be a lawyer. But without much exposure to the law, my consciousness and awareness was driven primarily by one case, right? Prior to law school, Brown versus Board of Education, the foundation-shaking 1954 unanimous decision that changed the course of civil rights in this country forever. So you have a consciousness of Brown as an example of what the law can do through the long-term efforts of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And you particularly in your mind focus on education, civil rights. Why? Because that's what I knew best. After 16 years of formal education before law school, I knew education as much or better than any other possible subject matter related to civil rights. Now, some of that came from what I read in books and what I studied in school, but honestly, some of it came from personal experience. So I had an experience going to high school with a white counselor on the verge of retirement who was assigning me to courses as a student who was skipping the 8th grade by recommendation of my teachers, going from 7th grade to high school, had very high test scores. And this counselor looked at my parents, our name, the elementary school that I went to, which was the most Latino elementary school in a medium-sized district. And this counselor told my parents that he wanted to enroll me in a mid-level algebra course, not the high-level algebra course, and see how I did in that mid-level algebra course. It was only the great courage and knowledge of my mother who said to that counselor that she would not leave his office until he enrolled me in the high-level algebra course, not the mid-level algebra course that he planned for me. But I also remember in high school being on a debate team that included a lot of my Asian American classmates and are being subjected to racial taunts as we exited our school bus to attend a debate tournament at an overwhelmingly white high school in the same region as our high school. But what I most remember is that despite attending a high school that at the time was very well integrated, it was about a third white in population, about a third Latino in population, and about a third Asian American Pacific Islander in population. Only major group missing, of course, was Blacks, but this was the San Gabriel Valley, and that was an integrated education. But despite that one-third, 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 I also recall knowing very, very early on that that would not be what my particular classrooms would look like. And I remember being in the highest level, honors AP, for history, for English, for calculus. Way back then, those were the only 3 that were available. But I remember there were only 2 of us, 2 Latinos in every one of those classrooms. My buddy, Victor Valdez, and me. That was it. A vast, vast underrepresentation in comparison to the student body as a whole. So with those issues, personal experiences, knowledge of what I had read, going to law school, my commitment was not just to do civil rights, but was to education civil rights. And then, as I said, you reach that point in con law, and you are required to read the case of Rodriguez versus San Antonio Independent School District, a case I hope many of you are familiar with. That is the 1973 case where the US Supreme Court determined, what is still the law today, that education is not a fundamental right under the United States Constitution. The meaning of that is that you cannot go into federal court even today to challenge most inequities in education unless you have evidence of intentional racial discrimination. You will be blocked from going into federal court by and large on education equity issues. Now, this case in Rodriguez was followed a few years later by cases in 76 and 77, Washington versus Davis, and the Arlington Heights case that made it extremely difficult to prove intentional racial discrimination through circumstantial evidence. Basically meaning that by and large, the federal courts to date are closed off from most education equity civil rights cases. That's where you feel like you're the victim of a bait and switch. Go into law school committed to doing educational civil rights work, and you realize Brown versus Board of Education is by and large a dead end. That is not the path for education civil rights issues as you move forward in your career. You are then left, as I think most of you know, with pursuing cases in state courts under state constitutional and statutory grounds to pursue education equity. And make no mistake, there has been great success in doing that. Starting here in California and in Texas through the Serrano versus Priest case and the Edgewood cases in Texas, efforts succeeded in establishing a fundamental right to education under state constitutions and the ability to then seek to change what goes on in state public education. However, there are a number of problems of being confined to state court, as you all may know or can readily imagine. Number one, this then becomes a 50-state, one by one campaign. That campaign, now 50 years after that Rodriguez decision by the US Supreme Court, is still ongoing. Just within the last 10 years, MALDEF established for the first time that New Mexico's state constitution guarantees education as a fundamental right and specifically guarantees an adequate and equitable education in public schools. But that is still ongoing half a century later. And that's the nature of having to do this state by state with 50 states. But you are also, of course, in front of state court judges. You're not in front of federal judges with life tenure who have no fears of being ousted from office. You're in front of elected state court judges who all of them, without exception, have in their minds their next election. And therefore, as much as they may believe in the right outcome, they are going to hesitate about ordering remedies that by and large are extraordinarily expensive in terms of government revenues. And finally, and I just mentioned this as an aside, but it's true, you face the prospect of not being able, if you are a nonprofit civil rights organization, as most of these cases are pursued by those organizations, of not being able, even when you win, to shift attorney's fees. That is, to collect your attorney's fees from the losing defendant, because you're under state law and it depends on whether the state has a fee shifting statute or not. I am every day grateful as President and General Counsel of MALDEF that Texas, despite its evident extreme conservatism, still has fee shifting under state law. And as a result, Texas has been the #1 involuntary funder of MALDEF throughout our 56-year history. But thank goodness they have fee shifting under state law. The state of New Mexico, where we continue to pursue the case I mentioned that established a fundamental right to education, but many years later, many years after a long and hard-fought trial court victory, we are still in court fighting over the remedy to be implemented in New Mexico. But New Mexico does not have fee shifting. So whatever we put into this case, we can recover our out-of-pocket costs, but cannot recover any of the hours expended by staff on those cases. So the challenges in state court are extreme, and we need to always remember that. And it certainly is in our calculation about how to be most effective in using the courts to champion education equity. And here is where I want to talk briefly about where I think MALDEF will be going or attempting to go. Here, I wish I had a chart. I don't. But I want you to imagine a 4-quadrant graph, okay, that is defined by macro versus micro on the horizontal and by input versus outcome on the vertical. So macro inputs is where this all began. Rodriguez, as I mentioned, was a challenge to how money was distributed among Texas school districts. Serrano and the Edgewood cases have to do with how money is distributed among school districts in California and Texas. So dollars are obviously the most important macro input. It determines a lot of what happens thereafter. But I would also say there are other kinds of macro input cases. I would put Plyler versus Doe in this category, because there the question was, are you going to be allowed to enter the school or not? That's also a macro input. Will you be given access to public education or not? So even though I've assured you that Plyler is under no imminent threat, long-term, we need to attend to the philosophy and the law behind Plyler, particularly if the right wing ever gets serious about actually attempting to undermine it. So long history of work in the quadrant of macro inputs, and that's ongoing and still important. We still have that New Mexico case. We've also, in the last 15 years, pursued a case in Colorado, and we are always looking at new places to do work on litigation in that macro input quadrant. Then if you look at micro inputs, also very important cases done there, particularly here in California. And here again, I would mention the Williams case. The Williams case, as I hope many of you will recall, dealt with 3 particular inputs, very important ones, but micro inputs, not the whole thing. I used to call it, I don't know if Mark knows this, so I'm sorry if he doesn't, but I used to call it the 3 T's that Williams dealt with: teachers, textbooks, and toilets. Toilets was a stand-in for facilities, the part of the case that Maldef was involved in. 3 T's are very important inputs. They are micro inputs, right? So that quadrant, also very important, explored with very important and significant and impact litigation like Williams. But I would also put in the quadrant of micro inputs issues like access to AP courses between schools, which was a major issue 20 years ago in California, where the disparities in availability of AP courses between certain schools, high schools, and other high schools came to light, and there were efforts legislatively by policy to ensure greater equity. Also a critically important micro input. So it still needs to be explored, but an explored quadrant. Then if you move to the quadrant, which under my scheme is in the lower left, macro outcomes, we also see work having been done there. Here I would put the No Child Left Behind policy effort, where the macro outcome was a summative test. We all know the problems with that. NCLB did not achieve what it should have achieved. It was problematic in so many respects, but it was a policy effort to focus on the quadrant of macro outcomes. The other area also explored here in California with great success were differentials in graduation rates, because whether you graduate or not, that's also a macro outcome. That's, it doesn't matter whether you're bottom of the class, top of the class, you got out and you graduated with a diploma. So efforts to increase equity in graduation rates is also in that lower left quadrant of macro outcomes. So bottom line is the quadrant of these 4 that I feel has been least explored and that I've asked my staff to look at exploring more is the micro outcomes quadrant. Now, there are a number of micro outcomes of great significance, both negative and positive. And some work has been done on the negative. So Maldef itself, together with CRLA and Greater Bakersfield Legal Services, was recently involved in a case challenging disparities in expulsions and involuntary transfers to continuation schools in Kern County. So that is a micro outcome. Expulsion, transfer to a dead-end continuation school is a micro outcome of tremendous significance for the students who experience it. And there was success in that case and others that target that particular micro outcome. What I have not seen, and I could be wrong, but what I have not seen is a lot in the area of micro outcomes when it comes to the positive side. Now, this would not be things like AP access, enrollment in an AP course, but it could be success in passing an advanced placement course. That's an outcome, not just about access to the AP curriculum and classroom. But what I have asked my education lawyers to do, particularly in California, and more on that in a minute, is to look at identifying the positive micro outcomes that we might focus on in a lawsuit or lawsuits to come. Why is that important? The virtue of the outcomes frame, and it is controversial. I will remark to you as another digression that many years ago in 2015, the last time that the Congress reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the late great friend Chris Edley put together a gang of 6, and we were negotiating what should be in the new ESEA reauthorization, what would become the Every Student Succeeds Act. And the 6 groups in this gang included 2 civil rights organizations, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and MALDEF, 2 teachers unions, NEA and AFT, and 2 administrators organizations. I believe it was Great City Schools and state superintendents. But frankly, it ended up being only 4 organizations negotiating because we were so opposed to each other, the 2 civil rights groups and the 2 teachers unions. And the main basis of our disagreement was this issue of inputs versus outcomes, because teachers unions don't want monitoring or measurement or consequences from outcomes because they have had bad experiences and been burned in the past, NCLB being, of course, exhibit number 1. On the other hand, civil rights groups have come to the point that we recognize the importance of both inputs and outcomes, and focusing solely on equity and inputs will not get us where we need to be. Because to go back to the macro input, we now all know that it's not just about money. Well, that's important. Equity and money is important. It does matter how the money is spent. And the policy decisions about how the money is spent are consequential. So we have come to the position that you have to monitor and have accountability around outcomes. So that was the clash. Ultimately, the gang of 6 failed to reach agreement, though we were close, before the bipartisan senators decided to put out their own version of ESSA, and that became the law that was enacted. But my point is, this inputs outcomes dichotomy is viewed as more oppositional than it really ought to be, in my view. But the virtue focusing on micro outcomes is that it leaves school district discretion theoretically intact, right? The reason school districts don't like longstanding desegregation decrees, and by the way, MALDEF is at the very end of a now almost 50-year decree in Tucson, Arizona. The reason institutions don't like that is they don't like being micromanaged, as they would say, by an appointed special master or by the court itself. The virtue is focusing on outcomes is that you leave it to the districts to figure out how to get there. You just put in place, measure the progress that require progress toward eliminating the micro outcome disparities. And they get the autonomy that they want as long as they produce. If they don't produce, then they have earned the intervention and micromanagement, quote unquote, of courts and special masters, but they get the initial opportunity to exercise their discretion. So that's where I have directed our education attorneys to look, not to neglect the other quadrants, still important work, as I mentioned, in New Mexico and on other issues, but I want us to explore that relatively unexplored quadrant of micro outcomes. So those of you who are academics in the room, I hope you'll think about this. We may come to at some point. Indeed, it's been in my plans, diverted by other priorities related to immigrant rights and voting rights, to actually invite Gary and Patricia to dinner and sit down with them and say, what is the micro outcome that is measurable, so we don't get disputes in court about the actual results, that is of significance beyond its apparent limited micro quality that we should be focusing on, because that's what I would like us to do. Now, Let me just end by saying why we're going to do this work in California. MALDEF is a national organization. Certainly the argument could be made that students in California are doing better equity-wise than those in Texas, than those in Arizona, than those in other states with significant Latino populations. But there are a couple of reasons. First and foremost, of course, the number of Latino students in public schools in California dwarfs any other. Far, far ahead of Texas, the second largest public school system for Latino students in the country. But perhaps more important is that California not only has a long established, now for 50 years, fundamental right to education in our Constitution, California is also one of a very, very small handful, 2 to 3 at best, of states that in state law permit private actors to come into court and challenge, through the disparate impact theory, discriminatory effects of significance that cannot be justified, and to eliminate those criteria, those policies that have discriminatory effects based on race, regardless of intent or motivation, based on state law. One of only 2 to 3 in the country that allow that. That means California is in the position, from the standpoint of litigation on education equity, to be in the lead and to be an exemplar for the rest of the country. And so, at least from the perspective of MALDEF, as long as my tenure continues, again, I'm at 15 years, it ain't gonna be 15 more. But that's where our focus will be, on continuing the work that we're doing, but really seeking to develop that neglected quadrant, if you will, of micro outcomes and disparities among them in California public schools. So I hope that that can be incorporated in the agenda of the Civil Rights Project for its next, I know, to be consequential 25 years. Thank you.
We're going to begin with Ilana Umansky, whose topic is California's Unrealized Opportunity, Multilingualism for All. Ilana is Associate Professor in the College of Education at the University of Oregon, and her work explores how education policy impacts the educational opportunities and outcomes of immigrant, multilingual, and English learner classified students.
Thank you, Patricia. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. And is this a little quicker? Okay, great. I'm Ilana Umansky. I'm happy to be presenting this work to you all today on behalf of an awesome team of researchers and advocates for California's multilingual students. As I'll describe, California has made great strides in the past decade and a half towards embracing a multilingual vision for California public education. However, the state hasn't yet taken the steps needed to realize that shared vision, and in fact lags behind the rest of the country in terms of access to and enrollment in multilingual programs. So in our report, we're going to call on California to make good on this vision. California's linguistic diversity is an immense asset. I think all of us in the room know this. Multilingualism is linked to increased tax revenue, decreased expenses in healthcare, less unemployment, increases in civic participation. And over 40% of California's K-12 population speaks or is exposed to a language other than English at home. This is an immense, almost immeasurable asset. Yet far too often, as we've been hearing today, throughout the day, our schools do more to strip students of their assets, and in this case, their linguistic assets, rather than cultivating them. We see this in problematic performance of EL classified students across a range of outcomes, culminating in only 15% of EL classified students graduating from high school, college, and career ready. Much research is pointing to the fact that many English-only instructional programs operate as second-class, this is not always the case, but oftentimes operate as second-class tiers within schools. We've heard a lot about within-school segregation and tracking. So they're operating as second-class class tiers within schools where students don't have the same access to resources and opportunities. Bilingual education is a solution to this underserving of California's multilingual students. There are wide and deep individual and social benefits of bilingual education. I've listed some of them here. These are established in strong causal research at this point. Importantly, these benefits are largely independent of bilingual program models. So we see them in dual language immersion programs, we see them in heritage language programs, we see them in indigenous revitalization language programs, we see them across a range of models. And these benefits are widely recognized at this point by both the California Department of Education, so at the state level and at the federal level, although I'm sure that infographic will be pulled down soon. And yet, California's history, of course, has seen waves of sentiment and law, both for and against multilingualism in schools. With the first English-only mandate as far back as 1872, and of course, as recently as Prop 227 in 1998. The last decade or so has seen several critical steps to promote multilingual education. The 2011 adoption of the Seal of Biliteracy, of course, Prop 58, rescinding 227, the EL Roadmap in 2017, and Global California 2030, which sets as a goal that half of students be in bilingual education by 2030, and 3/4 of students graduate biliterate by 2040. The issue is that none of these are binding. And while there has been small patchwork grants for bilingual programs and bilingual teacher development, there has been a real absence of systemic and comprehensive approaches to bilingual education expansion. As a result, California lags behind the nation in terms of the proportion of students in bilingual programs. There's only 16% of California's English learner students are in bilingual programs today. It's far below many other states in the country. California needs to take bold steps to expand bilingual programs to meet its own goals. Most fundamentally, and this sort of carrots and sticks idea came up earlier today, most importantly, California should take an approach that combines both mandates and incentives. Many states or several states have in place mandates related to bilingual education. They're usually attached to if a district has a particular number of students in a particular grade with the same home language. And pair these mandates with incentives, with strong incentives. Texas, which has been critiqued several times today, actually has a very progressive rule around bilingual education incentives, where every student in Texas, regardless of their English learner status and regardless of the grade that they're in, gets an extra additional weight if they are in a bilingual program. This, of course, supports expanding bilingual programs across grade levels, and it supports including former English learners into bilingual programs and never English learners into bilingual programs. So we think this combination of mandates and incentives would help us build and strengthen new programs as well as existing programs. And we point in the report to really thinking beyond just the elementary school level, where the vast majority of bilingual programs are in California today, as well as evaluating the state's progress, both in terms of access, but also in terms of equity goals as we expand these programs. Our second recommendation, of course, relates to teachers and building the bilingual teacher pipeline. Bilingual program expansion will only happen if California grows its bilingual teaching force, which right now is severely constrained. So in the report, we call for a state-level multi-stakeholder task force to really develop a comprehensive plan towards the bilingual teacher pipeline. I think we've heard some fantastic things today about supporting the teacher pipeline more generally. But we argue that it's important that we support, that the state support traditional credentialing programs, bilingual credentialing programs, but also use, I'm almost done. Also use grow your own type programs, teacher residencies, testing flexibility, et cetera. And importantly, supporting teacher retention as well. So I'll just close, I'll just take 30 more seconds and say that fundamentally, we need to prioritize English learner students in bilingual programs. And this means both on the access side and on the design and content side. So access in terms of where new programs are built, as well as seat allocation and eligibility, but also in terms of design and content. So centering equity, centering culturally relevant instruction and community-informed design. And I'll close there. Thank you very much.
I know it seems terrible to cut people off like this. There's a lot of smart people in this room, and we wanted to make sure that there's time for some interaction. So the next presentation is by Marcela Cuellar, who is an associate professor and the Chancellor's Fellow in the School of Education at UC Davis. And her research examines Latino student experiences and outcomes in Hispanic serving institutions, among other things. So Marcela is going to be talking about the community college BA, which is something we would like to have a higher profile of.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm honored to be here representing our collaborative paper that focuses on the potential of the California Community College Baccalaureate for closing racial equity gaps. As we know, California has some of the largest systems of higher education, thanks in part to the California Master Plan of 1960, which established different functions and degrees for the community colleges, California State University, as well as the University of California. And while this has been heralded for expanding post-secondary opportunities, the state's population vastly differs from 1960, with more students of color and low-income students. Many of these students start their journeys at a community college where many structural challenges remain, including a lack of adequate information for seamless transfer and proximity to four-year programs where students are able to meet their multiple responsibilities with work and family. As BAs remain a primary path to economic opportunity, access is clearly stratified in California, with community colleges being limited in offering bachelor's degrees. Our paper thus explores how offering bachelor's degrees at community colleges can help advance access to the BA and socioeconomic advancement, particularly among students of color. So our paper focuses on these California Community College Baccalaureates, or what we call CCBs. And these are four-year degrees offered at community colleges. In California, these were approved as a pilot in 2014, so that was 10 years ago. And they expanded in 2021 and really reflect a structural change to provide greater access to a BA for students across the state. This map here shows the location of those 15 pilot programs in 2014 and illustrates how these are spread out across rural, urban, northern, central, and southern regions of the state, really highlighting the geographic opportunity that they can provide to a BA. And these programs, according to the most recent figures, 38 colleges are now approved to at least offer one BA, and there are additional ones that are currently under review. Now, these programs also exist in 28 broad areas at the moment that are connected to good paying local jobs in high demand industries. And some of these include healthcare, like dental hygiene and respiratory care, as well as science and technology with biomanufacturing and cyber defense and analytics, as well as specialized areas like water resource management. We thus argue that state leaders can leverage the existing infrastructure or components of our state's education ecosystem to meet the economic and social demands of California and to close racial equity gaps with access to a BA. Now, there are promising outcomes, academic and labor market, with respect to these programs, both in California and across the country. To date, the state has offered 1,894 BAs through these CCBs. And earlier analysis from the Legislative Analyst Office provided a snapshot of the programs and who was accessing these programs and how they were completing them. Our report takes up that work and provides further analysis from these pilot programs to show how they are quality programs that are producing positive outcomes for students. We base the analysis from two distinct sources: the state's administrative data and institutional data collected by a consortium of CCB colleges. To describe the benefits and opportunities of these programs in California with respect to academic and labor market outcomes. And we use these two different sources due to differences in how these different entities count who is enrolling in these programs and how they are measuring progress and success. So based on the consortium data, these programs show strong graduation rates, with 67% of students graduating in 2 years and 76% graduating in 3 years. We do still see, however, gaps in graduation rates by race that mimic larger trends within the community college, with Asian and white students graduating at slightly higher rates than Black and Latino students. The gaps, though, however, are less for Latino and white students when we look at national data. So this shows that there can be the potential there that these programs offer to reduce racial equity gaps for BA attainment. And among those that were employed, they reported gaining $26,600 more after earning their degree than before when they entered the program. So as I mentioned, there are various other states that also offer these degrees. They exist in 24 states across the nation, both led by Democratic and Republican legislatures, really showing the bipartisan support for these types of degrees, given the ways that they can bolster local economies and advance social mobility for students. Florida and Washington are two of the states that have offered these degrees for quite some time and have now expanded the degrees at mostly all of the community colleges in their states. These states offer programs in a variety of different areas of study, sometimes overlapping with the four-year institutions. And Florida is a prime example here that despite 60% of their CCB programs being duplicated at four-year institutions, enrollment in either sector is not impacted, meaning that they're not competing with each other. They are actually serving very different populations of students. Those that are students attending these CCB programs tend to be adult learners and regionally bound. And so this kind of raises an example that this concern about duplication that is ingrained in our master plan might be one that we want to question a little bit more looking at these different states. Now, we provide a series of recommendations to advance the CCB moving forward. We think it's important to center racial equity in these programs as they expand or as new CCBs are created to ensure that there's intentional recruitment and marketing for these programs, particularly for students who can benefit from them, including students of color, student parents, and adult learners. And we also think that the legislation needs to center racial equity while at the same time highlighting the program's economic values. We also recommend that California provide a cohesive data infrastructure that is inclusive of these programs to really document and guide and support their success. We also recommend continued investment in these programs, and this should include rewarding the community colleges that are reducing equity gaps through this BA attainments, as well as providing rewards and support for the faculty who are teaching in these programs for the work that they do inside and outside of the classroom. And lastly, we want to recommend strategic expansion of these degrees, even if duplication might happen, given some of the evidence we see from Florida. And we strongly believe that by supporting and investing in these CCB programs, the access to a BA in California can become a reality for more students and support the continued vitality of our state. Thank you so much.
Exciting papers, right? So our third presenter is Sujin Jess, who is CEO of California Competes, Higher Education for a Stronger Economy. There have been a number of attempts made in California to change in certain ways the master plan. I mean, many of us have noted that the master plan can be a real impediment to greater success for students. So we asked Sujin to take on, and none of those efforts has really panned out. I mean, there have been lots of smart people working on this and nothing seems to happen. But Sujin was willing to take this on and propose something that really might happen. So, Sue Jin.
Good afternoon. As Patricia mentioned, I lead California Competes. We are a higher education policy and advocacy organization focused on the intersection of higher education, equity, and the economy. And we believe that higher education is a powerful vehicle for shared prosperity. But today, our state's higher education system operates under a framework designed for a different era, the Master Plan of 1960. This plan was a beacon of progress for its time, but nearly 65 years later, it now acts as less of a pathway to opportunity and more as a barrier. So Patricia and Gary asked me to be bold in helping set a new civil rights agenda and find solutions to persistent problems. So this proposal is intentionally provocative. It's designed to challenge existing paradigms and spark transformative discourse. So in the next 6 minutes, I'll touch on key aspects of the proposal and encourage you to read the paper if you find this interesting. So why isn't the master plan working for today's students and society? Changing demographics. As Marcella mentioned, today's college students are markedly different from those of 1960. There are more older adult students, there are more first-gen college students, more students from low-income households, more students of color, more women, on and on. So we have different students. Our economy is different. The state has moved from a traditional manufacturing and agricultural economy to an economy powered by technology and globalization. This is a complete reimagining of how we work and how we create and how we compete. And students' goals have changed. Today's students' primary motivation for going to college is getting a good job. And the thing that we hear so much about also, rising costs. The cost of college has far outpaced inflation, and investments in higher education have shrunk, which is putting more and more pressure on students and their families. This gap between what our higher education system offers and what our students need is glaring and resulting in low completion rates, longer time to completion, higher debt, and students struggling to transition into good careers. These questions that we hear so much about the value of higher ed, I can't help but wonder, are they driven by this misalignment? So it's evident we require a bold new vision. But before we can design a new master plan, California has to figure out what it wants from higher ed and reflect on its values. And here's what I've identified to drive the new master plan that I'm proposing. At the heart of this new master plan lies 3 fundamental goals for higher education: supporting California's democracy, our economy, and our society. There's more in the paper if you want to unpack those. But for the 7 minutes, to achieve these goals, I envision a system that really has to be guided by the key principle of equity, which then drives the following tenets. Accessibility, inclusive access to higher education must stand as a cornerstone of this proposal. Affordability, of course, cost shouldn't be a barrier to education. And frankly, I believe that college should improve students' present circumstances, not just their future. Meaningfulness, ensuring education provides long-term value for students, developing their humanity, deepening their relationship with the world around them, including and beyond job preparation. And adaptability. Higher education must be agile in handling rapidly changing contexts. A new master plan promotes adaptive structures, would deliver on all of these tenets. So I believe a new master plan that is centered on equity and these tenets will have a strong foundation for the quality and inclusive system of education and learning we need today. So from these goals comes a clear vision, a shift to designing a higher education system for students, not institutions. So I propose a single seamless system where students have clear paths to and through college at any stage of life. So clear your mind of what we have today and let's start fresh. So this new master plan I propose would advance a regional structure. Central to this proposal is the recognition that most students stay close to home and of California's vast geographic and cultural diversity. I propose that higher education institutions be organized by region to better meet the unique needs of local communities along with the state and beyond. Under this structure, each region would have a single university offering a wide range of educational opportunities, as well as enrichment and lifelong learning programs. This regional structure would extend beyond higher ed, integrating K-12 schools, employers, and community organizations to foster seamless transitions for learners into and from the workforce and community. Connections to careers. Connected to that tenet of meaningfulness, I envision a system where all programs integrate career preparation, providing clear pathways to the job students seek. To be clear, this is not to the exclusion of other purposes, so don't at me with like all goals matter or what about sort of other argument. Open access with numerous entry points. So higher ed should welcome any Californian with the ability to benefit like our community colleges currently do. Flexible learning modalities. It should also enable institutions to leverage agile strategies like credit for prior learning, competency-based education, and the use of technology to improve access and learning. A debt-free path to completion. Obviously, none of this will matter if students can't afford to go to college or complete their educations. So this proposal also focuses on ensuring affordability. And finally, and most importantly, a reconstituted coordinating entity. Lastly, to drive the design and implementation of this ambitious vision, we propose establishment of a coordinating entity to support state policy leadership and administer intersegmental programs. Now that I've laid out this proposal, let's walk through how it could work. I have two sample students. Guillermo. He's a recent high school graduate from Fresno. He wants to go to college, but doesn't yet know what he wants to study or what type of degree he wants. Fortunately, he has a clear pathway to California University Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley. Because California University is open access, Guillermo doesn't have to navigate a complex college-going process that would have started years before he considered whether college was the right path for him. After his first year, he realizes a passion for chemistry and takes a position as an undergraduate research assistant with a professor. This work-based learning opportunity deepens his understanding of chemistry and builds his professional work experience. He finishes his bachelor's and decides to pursue a career in research and a PhD in chemistry. He moves to LA, seamlessly enrolls in California University, LA, and completes his PhD. All right, I'm gonna quickly go through Rose because I'm out of time. A decade later, Guillermo's sister Rose takes a less traditional but more common route to higher ed. She wants to be a nurse and starts at the college immediately after high school, but stops out after a year to focus on family. A decade later, she's ready to go back to college, but she now lives in Redding. So she enrolls at nearby California University far north. She completes her credential and is able to become a nurse. Because she cares for her two young children, she appreciates that she's able to take courses online. And she thinks she might want to go further with her career. And she's comforted by the fact that she could re-enroll and continue on after getting her associate's degree if she wants to come back for further credentialing, because it's open access. You can come in and out as you go, no matter where you are in the state. So I will wrap up with there, but in addition to Rose and Guillermo, there are millions of Californians who could benefit from an institution and a state plan that looks like this.
The last presentation on our panel is by Mark Rosenbaum, and it's on the civil rights law California students need. Mark is Public Counsel Senior Special Counsel for Strategic Litigation. He's argued 4 times before the United States Supreme Court, 3 times before the California Supreme Court and U.S. Court of Military Appeals, and more than 25 times before the 9th and 6th Circuit, Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal. He's been dedicated to this work for decades. And if you can think of any area of inequity in education in California or the nation, he's probably been there and argued for solutions. So, Mark.
Well, we always win. And the reason we win is because we have experts like this working with us. I want to talk strategy with you all. I first want to begin by acknowledging 4 giants, 2 of whom are in this room, Gary and Patricia, 2 of whom we lost this past year, Chris Edley and Jeannie Oates. And one of the things that I learned from these individuals, and it was so interesting that Tom, who's one of the great civil rights lawyers in history of the country, but one of the things I learned is that you have to talk about systems. The AP example that Tom gave, I went to Jeannie Oates at one point to talk about a client of mine who was unable to get calculus in her high school. It wasn't offered. They put her in a sewing class. And I said to Jeannie, will you help me on the case? And Jeannie said, no, I won't. Not the way you're talking about it. The goal is not to get calculus for Rashida. It's to get a system, a pipeline, so that every child has the opportunity to reach their potential. And that's what I want to talk to you about, that it's our job to dismantle the channels of inequity that are making California not the crown jewel of education in this country, but frankly, an embarrassment in terms of the potential that our kids have. And I want to talk to you about a frame for addressing that. Look, talking purely about issues of policy, that hasn't worked. Talking purely about issues of moral rightness, that has not worked. Talking about issues of resources and having to deal with constraints, that hasn't worked. What we have heard all day today, and what everyone knew before they walked into this room, is that this is a matter of rights. And that is the lens that we need to be advocating on behalf of these kids who are not getting the education they deserve. As Tom told you, in 1879, the California Constitution, unlike the US Constitution, established education as a fundamental right, exalted it as a fundamental right. What's it mean? It means that in our state, this fundamental right adheres with every student. It affords heightened protection based on race, based on class, based on zip code, disability, homelessness, foster care. These kids cannot be denied the same opportunities as their more fortunate peers who are setting the prevailing norms when it comes to educational opportunity. And we're not taking advantage of that. The state constitutional right to education means what? It means that it cannot be upended by claims, well, this is due to poverty. Oh, this is due to racism. Oh, this is due to homophobia. Oh, this is due to a lack of resources. The right ensures that public education, and I'm not talking K through 12 because that's nonsense. It's pre-K to as far as these kids can go, that right serves as the linchpin of our democracy, that education is supposed to be the great equalizer, not the great unequalizer, and that it is a right that cannot be shortchanged, that it cannot be compromised through the political process where there are kids in this system who are thriving. And that at least as far back as 1992, our state Supreme Court has said that the ultimate guarantor to this fundamental right of education is the state of California. That can't be delegated out. It can't be outsourced. That's where the buck stops, and that's where the right is to be demanded from. As you've heard several times today, going back 70 years to Brown versus Board, 77 years to a landmark case, Mendez versus Westminster, it has been argued and it has been shown that public education today and forever in California is separate and unequal. It is a two-tier system that we know that serves a minority of students quite well and the rest not well and at all. Haves and have-nots in a system where that distinction should not exist. Access to resources for the haves and not so for the have-nots. And while another aspect of this Constitution, the genius of this Constitution, is that it doesn't even matter how the two-tier system developed. If it's there, it is to be dismantled. We argue that the principal reason that students in underserved communities are not being provided the necessary opportunities and resources and instruction to compete and collaborate successfully is systemic racism, and we should acknowledge that for what it is. And what we are calling for is the end of that two-tier system and for all children to receive a racially just education. and for a civil rights law that I'll come to shortly that aggressively attacks and destroys the discrimination that exists in the operation of all our public education institutions. That is, as everybody here knows, the most effective strategy historically employed in this nation, including California, to attempt to subordinate individuals, children, and their communities is the denial of a first-rate and equal education. It used to be that kids who were enslaved, it was a crime punishable by death to teach them. Now the attempt to subordinate is by making sure that certain kids in certain communities don't get a first-rate education. So what are the components of a fundamental right of education in California? One, that all children have access to fully staffed and fully resourced pre-K through access to college, that there be in every classroom well-trained and well-qualified educators and well-trained administrators, that there be sufficient mental health personnel in every school responsible for establishing trauma-sensitive environments throughout the school, because these kids are dealing with too much trauma in their lives to be able to learn, that there be support like aides and tutors and literacy coaches, because all kids are entitled to access to literacy using evidence-based strategies, that there be rigorous curriculum for all kids and all students sufficient to meet and exceed state higher education standards, and that be a pipeline, that there be culturally sensitive instructional materials and tools so that kids can identify and dismantle racism and sexism and anti-immigrant attitudes and practices, that there be instruction in art and physical education and digital access and access to AI and inclusion in meaningful ways of their communities, and that boundaries of school districts and attendance areas that create racial and economic segregation have to be subordinated to the requirement of equal opportunity. And we also suggest, as a new civil rights law, the establishment of an Office for Civil Rights in Education under the governor, a civil rights division that would have as its charge to dismantle discrimination, to file cases, and to issue equal opportunity regulations, and that there be an independent commission created on educational opportunities with members appointed for particular terms, leaders of the House to be involved in the choice, deans, and community structure. Look, there is not much hope in the data and the materials that we have seen today, but there is hope in this room. And there is hope in the communities. And most of all, there is hope in these kids. When I filed a case, an access literacy case, I went to Stockton and I talked to a group of individuals, a group of men who had been incarcerated. And they told me that they had learned to read in prison rather than in the same schools that we were litigating in that case. That is the school to prison pipeline in reverse. And that has got to be stopped. And it is on our charge. And until and unless we regard every kid as having these rights and fight for these kids' rights as if they are our kids, because they are our kids, then these kids don't have hope. But we can prevail. We can prevail once we take off and say, we're not going to let any kid get anything less than the first-rate education they deserve. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Castillo. I'm a legal assistant and organizer at Public Counsel, and I work with Mark. And I just wanted to take a minute or two just to provide a little bit of an example and context from our paper about one of our current cases and one of our current challenges against this attack against a racially just education. One of our current cases is in Temecula, California, and the Temecula Valley Unified School District. There, a conservative majority has taken hold of the school board and instituted a critical race theory ban. What this means, I could go into the list of ridiculous policies and statements that they've said, but essentially it makes it so that students and teachers are not allowed to discuss topics specifically regarded to racism, sexism, homophobia, and related topics in the classroom. And if they do discuss topics that are admitted to be deemed critical race theory, teachers are expected to focus explicitly and only on the flaws. So what does this look like on the ground? As an organizer, I work with many of the students and teachers that are a part of this lawsuit and understand better their experiences in the classroom and how this personally affects them. So one example is one of our teacher plaintiffs, Katrina Miles. She's the sole Black educator at our middle school and is also now the sole 6th grade teacher that continues to teach Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Before, it was a curriculum wide for all of the students in the classroom, but under these policies, a chilling effect has been instituted and taken in place that teachers now err on the side of exclusion rather than covering these topics. So what this means is it's a tension between the curriculum standards within the state of California, curriculum standards that mandate that teachers teach about the missions that negatively affected Native Americans in California, how hostility towards Chinese and Japanese laborers led to the anti-Asian exclusion movement, and how controversies over the expansion of slavery impacted California's statehood. In addition, there's also a policy that now institutes that by the 2025 to 2026 school year, schools need to offer an ethnic studies course. But how do students in Temecula make sense of these curriculum guidelines in the face of critical race theory bans like this? As a result, students can feel that their teachers are being chilled. One of our student plaintiffs, who is a leader for Black Student Union at her high school, speaks about whenever they're in the classroom speaking about civil rights topics or the history of civil rights in California, their teachers have told them to read these sections silently. And that's what's happening. Students are just reading them and not being able to have the chance and opportunity to discuss them. One of our other teacher plaintiffs continues to teach Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson and has her students read it, but she can no longer include the discussion that she usually includes about the criminal legal system in America and how we got to this point. As a result, students and teachers are left to introduce these topics, but have no critical discussion about how racism continues in today, how it didn't end at Brown v. Board of Education, and how these policies are continuing to attack their entire identities. As a result, there are no more critically responsive or culturally responsive pedagogies in the classroom. That's essentially banned, again, despite California's requirements that these be included in the classroom and the curriculum. I'll end just by saying that this case, unfortunately, our motion for a preliminary injunction in Riverside County did not prevail, but that does mean that we are going up on appeal, and we're hoping that by bringing this on appeal, we'll be able to establish precedent that works toward a right to a racially responsive education statewide.
We're now open for discussion, questions, answers, comments. These are 4 very provocative presentations, so I expect that there's a lot of stuff that you're thinking about. Nikki.
I don't mean to talk too much, but first of all, I'm a huge fan. I'm a paralegal by trade, so to hear you speak is such an honor, Mr. Rosenbaum. My question is—
Are you available this afternoon to start working on some of these?
Yes, for you, anytime. My question, you talked about the fundamental right for children to have fully staffed, well-trained, well-qualified teachers. Is there any actionable item, since higher education is not held to a standard of accountability, to ensure that teachers are taught how to teach children to read? Because that's not present now, and it's a complete barrier. And I've heard that the unions that protect those education systems are even bigger barriers than what we see on a daily basis here.
Great question. I answered a couple ways. The first way I want to answer it to you is, does it make any sense in a statewide system of education that higher education is separated from K through 12 education? It makes no sense whatsoever. It should be part of a uniform system. And part of the issue that we heard earlier today about teacher shortages, so-called teacher shortages. Well, it's true, there aren't teachers qualified in every classroom, but that's because the system isn't operating together to make that part of it. Imagine what it would be like if you said, look, you can get your education here, but that means that you serve in certain schools that where you can actually make a difference. So my first answer is to you, that's part of it. But the second part of it is absolutely. I've done literacy cases in California, and I've done literacy cases in Detroit under the federal Constitution. And we've won both those cases. And part of each of those cases was that there be requirements that the science of reading be taught and that there be teachers who were trained of it. And in fact, there was a study out of Stanford for the California case where we were able to get $53 million in resources for 75 underperforming schools. But the most important part, that there were strategic plans that involved teachers. And one of the requirements was that they know how to teach kids how to read, because we know how to teach kids how to read, and that the materials be present. So the answer is absolutely yes. And it should be part and parcel of every kid, not just the English teacher, but the math teacher, the science teacher. Every teacher should be part of a comprehensive literacy program. Absolutely.
Thank you. Mickey? Over here in front.
My question is for Marcel Cuellar. There's a current kind of aging crisis that's happening in California right now. By like the year 2060, the population is supposed to be like dramatically shifting. We have a Department of Aging here in California with these problems. And one of the things I noticed on your list of CCBA degrees is I barely saw anything on there related to health. And we know as like the population's aging, that we're going to need people to take care of the aging population. So what have you heard about, any new CCBA programs shifting towards like nursing, which is, and it's, nursing's traditionally like excluded from like the UC system. It's all in the Cal State system. So it seems like there's a real need for some of these types of programs that aren't there. And I'm just kind of asking if you know why.
Really good question, Nikki. That's goes to the crux of the problem here.
Yeah, that's been one of the challenging connections to kind of the master plan here. And this was one of the areas where recently there was some legislation out there to support the offering of nursing in some of these community colleges, just given the shortage that there is. And that was vetoed by the governor. And that has to do with some of that duplication of efforts that is, challenged in that master plan in its current iteration. So these programs right now, the way that they exist in California, they have to be in areas that show strong labor market need and that do not compete with the UC or the CSU in any sort of way. And so the UC and the CSU can question when some of those programs kind of overlap a little bit too much. And so nursing falls in that category. But when we look at other states like Washington, Florida, where these programs have expanded, nursing is one of the areas that they've allowed community colleges to offer degrees. And so we can learn a little bit more from those programs, how they've navigated those legislative processes to allow for those. And I think that that's one of the areas where more growth is needed. And the largest healthcare areas right now within California are dental hygiene and respiratory care, just given the environmental changes and the need of more credentials in those particular areas. But those weren't currently offered in any way in the CSU or the UC. So those were easier to kind of pass through. But I think you're pointing to like, here's like the elephant in the room. There's many areas where there's these shortages, but it's that duplication concern that we're going to have to figure out moving forward.
And that's why her data are so important, because they show that in other places like Florida, that duplication of programs doesn't seem to affect enrollment for those institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a crazy notion that we have a shortage of particular professions, and yet we can't, the community colleges can't pick up that up because it's viewed as duplication. Crazy.
Hi, good afternoon. Anya Hurwitz with Seal Sobrato Early Academic Language. My question is to Tom, to Mark, to Ilana. Have folks looked at Castaneda and proving the civil rights along with that dual language program is the highest quality, research-based, very, clearly causal data being the most research-based, high-quality program for English learners. Just curious if that has been something that's been explored. I'm also, in terms of the BA at a community college, wondering to connect the two kind of themes of this panel. Have we looked at education and how education, and certainly early childhood, because there's so much early childhood that happens at the associate degree level in community college, but if that's been something that's been explored as well. So there's kind of two questions, I guess, there. Thank you.
Tom, why don't you respond about?
So I would have to say it's not been explored, largely because Castañeda is not a great decision. It gives too much discretion to the school districts to experiment about things that were really way advanced from when Castañeda was decided. Maybe experimentation was appropriate then. It's not anymore. We now do know what really should be the standard, but the case really allows too much experimentation because of perhaps when it was issued, perhaps who issued it, the Fifth Circuit. So I would say it's not traditionally viewed as a strong vehicle for forcing districts to do what is right because there's too much wiggle room.
And the second.
You know,
part-
can I just add to that? It goes also back to the literacy question. We know what works and we know what doesn't work. And we also know the areas where it's still up in the air. But we know how to teach kids how to be fluent in English and fluent in other languages. And it's your job, because you're the experts, to get that message out there. That's how these cases aren't won by lawyers. These cases are won by the kids telling their stories and experts like you making clear that there's no doubt as to how it goes. It's insane that we're not teaching kids with the methods that we know work. And that has got to become part of the conversation. And when it does, we win. Look, go away from education for a second. The case that everybody here is most familiar with that established the right was the marriage case. And that's because by the time that case happened, everybody understood what the underlying equities were, and everyone could feel it. And that's what we have to do with these kids. We know how to teach these subjects, and we know what works, and we know all kids can learn, and we know all kids want to learn. And it's your job. It's on our watch, because you know what the data says. And as great as the data is in this room, it's got it. Every Californian has to know it and understand it. And once that's out there, then that question will be answered. It will be answered properly, and kids will be able to learn. And in terms of the community colleges, that is just such a neglected part of our educational system. It is not working the way it was intended. That is part of the system as well. And that should be a source for all the things that's your part of. But it is treated as something that's under the rug. And we have to take it out. It's community colleges. It's for communities. And we need to make that part of the system. And it will thrive if it's there.
Thank you. Shelley.
I'm sorry. Sorry. So I'm going to try one more way with you, Tom. We have taken your paper, Ilana, to many, many spaces in terms of having people speak up for what we know works, right? And so when I heard you talking, I think, or I'm wondering, is this a micro outcome to have more bilingual programs with a macro result of students doing better and becoming bilingual and biliterate, contributing citizens to our country?
So it's actually a micro input, but a very critically important one. So to get into the lower left quadrant that I want to explore, we have to translate that into outcomes. But yes, there may be a basis in California law, especially after the repeal, to try to, in this state, use the state of research currently to force, you know, the answer is going to be resources and is it available to be implemented statewide, et cetera. And those are issues we have to grapple with. But yes, I think there is an opening under state law to do this.
Very good.
Hi, my name is Jenny Johnson. Shelley, it's great to go with you after you all the time. So I just want to take a pause. I'm geeking out right now because I'm fans of all of you up there. I'm with Calbright College. We're a state online community college. We got off to a rocky start, but we have about 4,000 students. We just finished our 1,000th student completing their program. We're in 52 of the 58 counties. I'm not talking just to talk, I promise. I just love being part of this conversation. First generation Latina, my mom was one of 9. I didn't know the difference between SAT, UC, CSU, community college. And I had a mentor who said, you're not going to go in stupid classes. You're going to hustle and you're going to do it. I'm a graduate of a community college, a CSU, and a UC law school. And I appreciated what you said about fighting. I got my ass kicked and I graduated in 2003. Calbright's delivering, and I'm sharing this with you because I loved your question, sure, about community health. We're creating a community health care worker program in the late spring, and we have a labor union that wants to work with us, that is dying to work with us. We see hospitals closed up and down the state. And when you talk, I loved that you talked about how we can engage in this duplication. We shouldn't be competing. We should be complementing each other's work. I love that we have the academics up there, but we all know friends and family. This is real. We know these people. And so I'm sorry I went off on a number of tangents, but it's such an honor to be here with all of you. And at Calbright, we want to be part of the solution. Thank you.
I don't know if it's like kind of already been answered. It's around the community colleges. I've been an advocate for promoting the teacher credentialing being part of the community college system. And we've gotten the same pushback around the duplication, but there's another element that has come up around whether or not the community colleges are qualified to give the subject matter expertise that is required for teacher education. And it falls in the same categories as I think as nurses, where it is a career that is in need. And we're already credentialing so much of our early education teachers from this community college system. But it's been something that every single room I step in and mention that we should be utilizing. This entire massive entity that we have across the state has gotten that pushback of whether or not the community college as a system can support that. What do you say to folks who are coming with that type of lens?
I think Patricia might have a few things to say here as well with some earlier work that kind of led to the study when looking at these baccalaureates. I think this is an important question of like, well, do you have the capacity, right? With the faculty, the equipment and all so on and so forth. But I think that's where the investment needs to come from the system to support these colleges to develop them. Oftentimes, what I understand is that many faculty are equipped with the credentials, with the experience to do this work. And again, when we look at other states, they're offering BAs, BSs in education and credentialing at the elementary, secondary. So there's things for us to learn from other states, I think, in these examples, and that there is possibility there. And I believe that your study, was it with Hartnell College? That was
one of them, but we looked at several colleges that were doing exceptionally well with students of color, getting them transitioned through. And we found a number of community colleges around the state that were very strong, had really strong faculties, they were ready to go. But, you know, all universities and colleges and schools have to be reviewed by a board. So everybody has to meet certain criteria. And there's no reason why you couldn't just go through some of the stronger community colleges in the state and give them the opportunity to meet those criteria to provide the BA. It's much more political than anything. People don't want to give up power and resources.
So a question
I wanted to follow up on that really quickly. And I wanted to point out that we've focused a lot on our public higher ed segments in this conversation, but we have a really robust private higher ed institutions in our state. And when the public higher ed institutions don't step in to meet the needs of Californians, private institutions or public institutions from other states are coming in and filling this need, which, you know, I in California Competes, we are for the Californian first before any institution. But it does break my heart a little bit when our public systems are not meeting the needs of our state. So thinking about teacher ed, I could name a number of out-of-state programs that are meeting this need and partnering with our school districts to train paraprofessionals who are working really hard around this work, and same with nursing, et cetera. So it just, I think you know, obviously I talked about the master plan, but like the way we've structured higher ed in our state no longer works. When you think about it, it's being driven by mission, about selectivity, and sort of what responsibilities that each institution has. I think we really need to challenge this, and we can do it piece by piece. We can do it, you know, blow it all up. I don't care, probably both ways, but it's really broken. And if we want our public higher ed systems to continue to be, I think, the best in the world, we've got to fix this. Otherwise, we're going to have every other state's higher ed system coming in to serve California.
Well, this picks up, I mean, thanks, Sujan. It's very connected to my question that I got a sneak peek at your paper, but it's connected to the question about what the legislature can do with it. It was asked earlier. And part of it is this onus on students to take their credits and move them around. And one of the reasons the baccalaureate program at a community college is so attractive is because students don't have to navigate a transfer, which we know is highly challenging. So one thing we can do is just ensure that students' credits count wherever they go, which is kind of the mechanism behind your kind of larger transformative idea of the master plan. And so I guess that's my question for Elsa, is sort of how you think about that to allow you to kind of follow up on, is it blowing up the system and creating a new one as you kind of presented, or is it, you know, ensuring that our existing systems are more adaptable to accept, so that any student could go to the existing colleges and take their credits with them?
Well, you know, I think everyone says like new construction is easier than remodeling, but I don't think we really have that option. So I think we have to sort of probably do a little bit of both. I think we could do a lot more around credit mobility and recognizing that students learn in lots of places, including lots of different institutions, some that are regionally accredited, some that are not, some in the military or the workplace, volunteering, et cetera. How do we make sure those credits count? But I also think, you know, while we can't just blow up and start over, I do think the sort of incremental approach will be really important to help us understand how do we do a bolder approach, even if it's not a blow it up, but like a really significant reform. Like we have to understand, what does it take for community colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees and grapple with some of these things around what is the skill that faculty then need? Is it really a master's degree or a PhD? Or, I mean, we often had adjunct who had, I actually probably shouldn't say anything because it may not have been following rules, but had the right skill set to teach a certain course, and they were excellent. So I think it's just, we need both to be able to figure out how do we effectively blow it up. This paper is much more detailed than my 7 minutes, but to do something like this, we still need a lot more information. But I agree that this credit mobility is a big issue, and one that I will say California Competes is also working on with our partners at Sac State and Shasta College and other colleges around the state.
Although, McCall, in addition to credit mobility, we know, and we've known for a long time, that every time students have to change institutions, we lose a lot of students, and particularly students at the community college who tend to be lower income, have fewer resources, and have families. So they're just not mobile. And we're convinced that we could get a lot more students successfully through a BA program or BS program if they didn't have to physically move to some other place in order to do that.
A big part of where I came up with this design was I spent a lot of time in the state archives reading about, you know, letters from legislators as they were developing the master plan. And transfer was a big issue then. And I kind of thought it's still an issue today. I know Jesse Ryan was here, spends a lot of time thinking about this. And I thought, like, when do we give up? Should we just get rid of transfer? And so I thought about, how do we then get rid of all of these transitions, ones that, you know, from high school to college, transfer to the workplace, and just make it a lot more seamless. And that's where this ended up, was let's just get rid of these problem points rather than trying to keep tweaking to bridge them. And just heard a commercial from Kaiser. And if you've seen this, where they talk about the benefits of Kaiser HMO, and they said, it's your generalist and your specialist and your billing and your insurer all in one. We make it easy. And I thought about, wow, what if I read, I mean, I'm not like a Kaiser opponent, but like that thought around like, how do we make it easy for the user? So you're not, in labor and thinking about, wait, is that anesthesiologist in network? Am I going to get billed for this? Right?
Very good.
That's actually really related to my question. Because some of the work we're doing with Hayward Promise Neighborhood is really trying to braid that like cradle to career piece, because we have early childhood, we have K through 12, we have community colleges and a state college, like all in our city, and college matriculation rates have been dropping. So that's kind of what we're working on. But something I'm kind of curious about when it comes to some of these barriers that I think AI might actually be able to come in to solve, and AI could also come in as a competitor in some of these spaces. I'm kind of wondering how that's been kind of seeping into the research and, policy endeavors looking ahead.
Yeah, I can touch on that quickly. I think AI is obviously this brave new world, and I think we should approach it with what are the opportunities we have with sort of thinking about the ethics and challenges. One thing that there's a professor at UC Berkeley, Zach Pardos, who's working on how do we leverage AI to look at transcripts around articulation and transfer. So basically faculty then could really focus on the things that faculty uniquely can do and thinking about what counts and what doesn't count, and isn't spending the many hours that we don't, the sort of administrative burden. So how can AI get rid of that? Also really interesting stuff around credit for prior learning and assessing, what workplace skills you may have that you're bringing in, that if you're a manager at, I don't know, Craig and Auto Parts, and you're going to college now and majoring in business, you likely have some skills that are college level, but you may not know what they are, how to articulate them. And a faculty member who's never worked retail may also not be able to look at that resume and understand what did that job entail that actually I teach in my program. So AI can also help connect those, especially as we get more data around them. And I think we'll see a lot more around that. If anyone's interested in this, I highly recommend attending the ASU GSV conference. It's in April in San Diego. We are building a more California higher ed policy. Folks, to go, please come talk to me. We're hosting events there, but there's just so much really cool stuff. And it breaks my heart that I feel like I see so few California higher ed people there thinking about how do we leverage technology to better serve students in open access and deepen learning.
Okay, I think we are just about at the end of our program today. I don't see any other burning questions out. A burning question?
You listed many fundamental rights, so thank you. Many fundamental rights towards education. And thinking about the current way our public education system is funded, what are some ideas you have about switching that to make sure that we have the necessary funds in order to have equitable, inclusive education?
I think everybody in the room agrees. The funding system is absolutely backwards. It starts with an amount of money that you have to spend, and then that determines what programs, where that money goes, as opposed to saying, what do these kids need in terms of equal educational opportunity, and then go to the resources themselves. The resources should not be the way that the priorities or the way that the rights are in fact exercised. And I think we need to take that on. It's not good for the state, and it's certainly not good for the kids. It's exactly backwards. And I think I never file a money case because the issue, of course, the issue is resources. I file what these kids need, and then a court orders all kids should have access to literacy, and then the funding has to come to that. I think we have to challenge that head on, the way that our system works, and say the first thing is, what do these kids need to get equal educational opportunity? And then down the line, figure out what it costs to do it. Does that answer your question? It's just a completely backward system in terms of letting some sort of arbitrary number determine the quality of education that the have-nots get, as opposed to saying, what do these kids need in order to compete and to thrive? And then say, okay, now let's get the funding to make that happen.
In the next 2 or 3 minutes that we have before we go to the raffle, the book raffle, we listed a question on here for everybody to consider at the very end of the day, and that was, what role should California play in an anti-civil rights era? And can the state be a beacon for the nation? I'd like to, in about 25 words or less, I would like to know what the panel thinks about that. Atlanta, can California do it? And should they, or should we be looking
I
elsewhere?
hope so. You know, my sense is that the federal environment is not going to be here to protect us for the next 4 years. And so the onus is on states and on civil society. And so I think the responsibility is enormous. And I hope that I know California sees itself as a leader in this way. And I hope that California is successful.
I think obviously we're California.
Can we do it?
Absolutely. I think so. I'm very bullish on our state. I think we have the best people. We have like so much diversity, geographic, cultural, industry, economy. I think that in a huge economy, I think there's no reason why our state can't be a beacon for this. And I think we have, I feel like, the progressive interests to move this forward. And I also think, you know, at California Competes, we're a nonpartisan organization. I also feel like we very much have Republicans in our state who support civil rights as a major issue. I think we would be our own sort of enemies in getting this work done. So I appreciate this like moment to set a bold vision, to sort of regroup and to move forward. And I can be a little Pollyanna-ish sometimes, but I almost think that like the new administration maybe is the galvanizing moment for us to say, okay, let's really figure out what this means for us and how do we get this together and work together for a better California. And as the rest of the nation looks to us, a better nation.
I think that's really lovely. I think it would be a terrible mistake if all we do, and nobody's saying this, but all we do is play defense. Obviously, we have to prepare for the atrocities, the inequities that's coming down, and we've got to fight back hard. But we have to go forward with an aggressive civil rights agenda. And I believe in stories, and I believe those stories of enlarging the rights, not just keeping the status quo, not just saying we're not contracting as much as we could, but enlarging what civil rights are. First of all, it will serve our people. It'll serve our communities. It's what our communities want. It's what these kids want. And I think it will be a model. We have to trust, just thinking about education, that if we can educate all these kids to their potential so that they can better their circumstances and be meaningful participants in our democracy, that is going to be a story that will win over the nation and win over the planet. And so I think rather than to put on the brakes, we ought to hit the accelerator hard.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Marcella?
I think that's a great place to end. I don't know that I could follow up with that, but I echo everything. I think it's our time for us to lead, continue to lead. And when I think about higher education, I think about how the master plan in its time really did create a leading system for the nation, for the world to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say, well, isn't it time for us to think what the next 100 years of leadership should look like? So I think it's an opportunity and an invitation and a responsibility for us to lead.
Fantastic. Thank you. Gary Orfield?
This is exactly what we were dreaming of when we thought about this day here in Sacramento. You know, really strong, committed, relentless group of people who know what they're talking about, who want to spend a full day thinking hard about the future. And there are people in this room who could write the books that are needed, who could write the reports that are essential to help make these cases that they can. Don't give up. Think about what you can do and think about how we can work together to get it out into the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming and joining with us. This has been a terrific day. Thank you.